Charity Davenport. So I'll give a quick little intro to her. Let's make sure the recording has resumed. Great. So Charity Davenport is an instructional technology specialist in accessibility at Pellissippi State Community College in the Pellissippi Academic Center for Excellence, also known as PACE. Charity is bringing us the whole experience of an ESL instructor who created an open textbook, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're going to hear about the triumphs and the pitfalls of producing your own OER. I was lucky enough to see Charity Davenport last week at the Cal OER conference online, and this is a really good one if you need some inspiration and some how-to on creating your own OER. But I'll let her talk about that. Charity Davenport, everyone.
All right. Let me make sure I'm in presentation mode. Oh, and my captions are on. I'll turn those off. All right. Everyone can hear me and you can see my slides. I'll just make sure. Okay, good. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Charity Davenport. I will say this was a super crazy week for me. That's why I had to do my session on Saturday. I feel lucky because I am going to talk a little bit about the Creative Commons certificate, which I think was in the previous keynote. And then the next one is about Pressbooks, and my open textbook is in Pressbooks. So I think I'm in a good little sandwich here. And also, I am from Knoxville, Tennessee. That's where Pellissippi is. And we recently had, if you haven't heard, we had an F2 tornado come in on Monday. So I'm just happy to have electricity and not a tree in my house and on our car like my neighbors. So I'm just happy to be here and be able to share this journey once again with everyone here. And so a little bit of information about my past life. I love languages. I think that's the main reason why I became an English as a second language instructor. But I especially loved Latin and like Roman and Greek mythology. And that led to, I love the connection between Latin and other languages and how that affected English. So that was kind of a big thing when I was teaching English. I was an ESL instructor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville for 13 years. And then I decided I want to do something a little bit different, but I don't want to leave education. I kind of don't want to leave teaching, but I love technology. What in the world can I do to kind of put those two things together? And found out about the field of instructional design and instructional technology. So the end of 2021, I got my second master's in instructional technology. And I am going to talk a little bit about my experience in creating my open textbook and copyright things. So I do want to have a disclaimer that I am not a lawyer when I talk about these things, but I did go through the Creative Commons certificate program that I believe Jennifer mentioned in the previous session. She was one of the facilitators for our Creative Commons certificate. So I am very interested in copyright and Creative Commons licensing, and that was a huge part of my process. So the text that I am talking about is my open textbook called It's All Greek to Me. It is using modified and adapted Greek mythology stories and academic readings related to those stories for like advanced ESL students. It took way longer than it should. And that's kind of the reason why I'm here, to help make this process not as long for other people. I made a lot of mistakes along the way. And it'll probably never end. I still have some things I want to do with my textbook. It's kind of different from a lot of OER textbooks, where usually the whole textbook is one license, but it's basically a collection of items, images from different licenses. So it's more of a collection with individual licenses. Some stuff is from the public domain. Some stuff I had to write myself. It's available online, and if you get the PowerPoint slides, you can have a link to it. It's available online in Pressbooks and in a very inaccessible but very nice professional looking PDF as well. So before we begin, I do have a few questions, and you can put them in the chat. And my first question is, have you ever created an OER? And then why? What spurred the creation of that OER? So I'll give a little time to answer that question. So we have no, I have not. No, where to start, how to do it, how to have time. So yeah, that was something from the last one. Is I think a lot of people hadn't created an OER. And I think one of the big things that spurred my inspiration to make this kind of session is I went to so many different, either an OER conference or OER sessions at other educational conferences, and they talk so much about how wonderful, how great, how beneficial OER are. And they say, oh, just go to Merlot and take a look, or just go to OER Commons and take a look. And they don't really talk about how, yeah, it is time consuming, or it is a thing of, I don't know who can help me. I don't know where to go. I don't even know where to begin. So I feel like by talking about my process, which was really different, and my mistakes, that maybe that can help you with some ideas on how to get started. And yeah, I like this wonderful one here. I co-created an OER to use CAD software because nothing was available. That's going to be one thing that I talk about in my session. I think that's probably the first thing. So these are my steps. You don't have to follow my steps, but this was kind of my process. So the first step was I had an idea. When we teach ESL at the old institution I was at, it's very academic focused, because the goal is basically to improve our students' English so that they're able to go to the university. So it's very academic focused. But I would notice, I would hear, I would sometimes see in the textbooks things like, oh, it opened Pandora's box, or it was a Sisyphean task, or it was a Herculean task. And that kind of spurred this idea of, hey, I know what these mean, but our students don't know. And they have such like a cultural and there's so much rich history behind some of these phrases. I wanted to do some research. I found these wonderful books here. It's Greek to Me by Jove, that kind of explained some of the vocabulary and idioms that we get in English that come from Greek mythology. So I looked at these books and I thought, these would be really great to to share with students. But in these books, the way that it presented the information, it kind of assumed that you already knew something about these stories and about Greek mythology. So I thought, well, I'm already trying to sneak in literature to our very academic classes. What is a way that I can incorporate these stories and incorporate a little bit more literature in the classroom? So the second step was, okay, we have an 8-week semester. How can I kind of organize some kind of lesson or some kind of thematic unit that I can attach to our currently existing textbook, and organize the different vocabulary into different themes? I really noticed a pattern of these are very universal themes, such as love, all the love stories, all the adventure stories, all the stories about death and the underworld. So this is my thought process in trying to organize these themes into, I think it eventually was a 6-week thematic unit that I kind of attached on alongside the traditional textbook. And so I started doing that. I did that for maybe 1 semester. And I realized it wasn't really working. First of all, at our institution, we were just assigned textbooks, and I didn't really have much of, at least at that time, I didn't have much of a say in which book I would get. And I noticed that me and the textbook were not friends. We didn't click. It was really hard for me to see the connection between what my students needed in that class and what the textbook was trying to accomplish. And so almost always supplemental resources were needed. I started to notice the value of reading literature for language learning, and thinking about if we're supposed to prepare these students for a university experience, they're going to be reading literature in the classroom. They're not just going to be reading their biology book and a history textbook. They're going to be reading literature. So I had this extra push of trying to put literature into the classroom. So basically what I did was we would do stuff from the textbook during class, and then the literature reading, the Greek mythology themes, that was the supplemental resources and their homework. But it was really hard to engage my students with either one. First of all, what we were doing in class with the textbook was not engaging, and they may have liked what they were reading and doing with the homework, but we didn't have any time in class to discuss it because we were busy working with our required textbook. So it was really hard to get them involved in either one. So I decided to fight the system and I decided, okay, I have to choose. We're doing either our textbook or we're going to be doing the literature. And so one semester, I told students, the textbook that you were forced to purchase, we're not going to use that one. At that time, it was a little bit different system for purchasing textbooks. Basically, we bundled all of the textbook costs into a flat fee. And then that also meant it wasn't possible for me to say, hey, why don't you just take $50 off because we're not going to use this textbook. So students were a little unhappy about that in the beginning. there was definitely some backlash from our director who was not happy about this. So what I did was I took those thematic themes. I created kind of like a little lesson packet each week. I would print out copies of the readings, worksheets. I bought a little notebook for them to put it all in so that it kind of felt like they had a textbook. And part of what I did to kind of compromise with the director was, okay, I know that these are very literature heavy, so why don't I find some authentic articles like New York Times, Washington Post? I'll find some articles that have been published that are related to the story. So for example, we would read the story of Echo and Narcissus, and we would discuss that. And then the next reading would be, let's read an article about narcissistic personality disorder. So it gets some of the academic content, and I tried to find articles from different fields, and they get the literature, and they can see the connection, the real world connection of how these vocabulary and these stories are being used today. And even though they basically didn't use their textbook that they paid for, it was a huge success with the students. They loved it, especially the part where I'm using authentic sources with them. They said, like, I felt like I was really part of an actual university class. So it was a huge success. And then I started thinking about how many photocopies I was making from different books. I was using, at that time, I was using D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. I was using this other kind of what I wanted book where it had Greek mythology stories and kind of explained the vocabulary and the cultural significance, copying articles from different newspapers and magazine sources. And I was like, this sounds illegal. I knew about public domain and a little bit about copyright stuff. And so I didn't like that. I also didn't like that I was just handing out papers every week. I wanted it to be an actual like book for them. So I met with a course packet representative to kind of estimate the cost of all of these things I was using. And it was going to be about $200 for each course packet. And that's when I realized I created a monster that I can't share. I am doing so much great work for me and for my students, but my name is Charity. I like to share. I was like, if I'm going to do all this hard work, I want it to be something that everyone can enjoy. And so I remember I thought about public domain. I thought these stories are thousands of years old. I can at least maybe go back and look at the stories and replace them. I started noticing the little Creative Commons symbols on things and did some research about that and what that means. And so the next step was, okay, I have to restart everything, don't I? And I went to a librarian and asked for help. She basically said, yeah, we're going to have to start replacing, if you want it to not be a $200 book, we're going to have to start looking at different materials. But she looked at what I had and she was super supportive of it, and she thought it was great, and she was very excited to help me in making this something that could be more open. So I basically had to start over from scratch. But I did it piece by piece. I was still doing the same thing where each week I would pass them a new reading, new worksheets, but it was just article by article, lesson by lesson. I think that's one of the big takeaways, I think, is it feels like it's a huge endeavor, but you can just do it one chapter, one reading, one worksheet at a time. And eventually you'll have a collection that's great to put together. I did take, I think, two, not back to back, but I did take 2 semesters off using my annual leave to work on it. If it wasn't just doing research and rebuilding, it was kind of going on vacations to go take pictures of like Greek statues or something, or finding things to take pictures of, because if you take the picture, you own the copyright. I did start over. I was using iBook Author, which is awful. But then I went to LaTeX. Does anyone know what LaTeX is? LaTeX is basically a formatting language, coding language. It's mostly used in like math and more scientific fields for formatting like functions and equations, not necessarily for making a pretty English textbook, but that's what I made it in. It looks very nice. It was a huge hassle. I do not recommend building your OER in LaTeX unless it's math related. Then I could see some benefits. I felt more free. That was another big thing. I feel like copyright is so constricting. And I thought about, like, I'm using these New York Times articles and they're great, but legally, I can't adapt it for my students. I can't use it in my textbook to share with other people. So when I was getting Creative Commons licensed work, public domain works, there was so much more I could do to adapt it to make it better for the audience of English language learners. So a big thing I did was I analyzed every single text using the COCA corpus for, I don't remember the acronym, but it's a huge corpus of words, frequency, how often they are used. Very helpful for replacing obsolete language that was in some of the texts from the 1800s that aren't used anymore. I could find words that had a higher frequency. That's going to be more useful for someone learning English in 2023. It also helped me analyze the language from like academic and literary vocabulary. So again, trying to persuade people that this literature can help students studying for an academic environment, because this vocabulary will be helpful. So a lot of things I could do to adapt it better for my students. And then getting student input was super helpful. They would like, what does this question mean? What do you want in this question? Okay, maybe I need to reword this question, or this paragraph is really confusing. What does it mean? And then taking a look and saying, oh yeah, this paragraph is really confusing. How can I change it to be better? And being able to change it on the fly when I was using it in the classroom. Ooh, I'm realizing I only have like 5 minutes left. Oh my gosh. The next step was not only me piloting it in the classroom, but other people piloting it, kind of shifting that away and not really liking that process, because it made me realize how dependent a lot of our instructors were. Oh, I have until 11. Okay, thank goodness. how reliant instructors are on textbooks. And so they didn't know how to be flexible and jump from different chapters or do things in a different order in the textbook. One of the instructors said she had a problem because students didn't really understand the vocabulary in some of the readings. And I was like, well, I have a vocabulary exercise in each of the chapters. And she said, well, it's at the end of the chapter. I was like, well, then why don't you do the vocabulary exercise first before you read? And she said, well, if you want people to do that, you need to put the vocabulary exercise before the reading. And I thought, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So I moved all of those vocabulary exercises to the beginning. So yeah, it was interesting. They didn't really know how to use this textbook. And it made me realize a lot of textbooks for ESL come with an instructor's guide. So then I worked on an instructor's guide that kind of gave them different pathways on how to use the textbook. Do they want to focus mostly on the academic texts? Do they only want to focus on stories? Different like active learning and active reading strategies, different things they could do with their students using the textbook. Then, unlike most people, that's when I won a grant, was after I finished my textbook. I feel like a lot of times people hear about a grant, they write their proposal for it, then they make it, and then they get their money. But I made it first. The librarian I was working with said, you have something really good here. Maybe you should apply for this OER grant. And so I did, and I won. However, it did have some conditions. I had to use it in a 4-credit course. Our institution was in a different place where it was non-credit because these were not yet university students. That was easy to do because we did have like a transition course at UT, but I also had to make it available online. At this point, I only had it as a PDF. So I had to start, not necessarily start again, but I had to rebuild what I had put in LaTeX into Pressbooks. And then that also meant I had to, if I made changes, I had to make sure that I didn't forget to make changes in both the PDF version and the online version, which was kind of a pain. And then the last step was have a pandemic and everyone really, really, really loves your book because there's not a lot of ESL materials online for instructors to use. For me, it was extremely easy to pivot online. I was also in the middle of my master's that focused a lot on online learning. So that was a little bit easy, but I decided that semester to use my book. So it was easy for me to pivot my classes online. And then I would get emails from people in Vietnam, China, in Florida, other different states who were like, thank you so much for having this book available, because I had no idea how we were going to switch to only online materials so quickly. So it was a success. Thinking of the future, now that my role at my new institution is focused on accessibility, I think it's only fair that I should also, at least in the Pressbooks version, I have gone back and done some accessibility updates, but I probably need to do more. I'm actually planning on shifting, now that Pressbooks is kind of paywalled, I'm going to put my book in My book is already in LibreText, but I want to go and make sure that one's accessible. I'm really interested in H5P interactive pieces. I want to add those. Yeah, Pressbooks did give me some sustainability concerns for my book. That's why I feel like it's really important that it's in different places and there's still the PDF that's downloadable so that it can live somewhere. I'm very interested in AI and what it could maybe do for like AI generated text that could be, Creative Commons licensed. And I feel like OER is always iterative. It's never finished, but at some point, I would like to do other things. I would love to make another OER something that someone could use. So I'm always constantly thinking, when is it time to stop this project and start the next one? So I have another question. For those of you, or the one or two who have created an OER, what was one takeaway that you would like to share to someone just beginning their OER journey? I'll give maybe 1 minute for that. And then I'm going to quickly go through some of my takeaways. Get paid. It was a lot of time and well, I wouldn't say no benefit, but I didn't get money until I got my grant. I got a lot of benefits from my students. It was an amazing experience seeing how my students liked it and other people's students. Rubric for accessibility. Yes, definitely keeping accessibility in mind in the initial design and creation will save you a lot of time. If you're working in a group, yeah, I did all of this by myself and I don't recommend that either. I definitely recommend working with librarians, colleagues, work with a group. But then, yes, when you do that, it's basically like, what is the project management, the timeline for when other people are going to give you their work? Yeah, set up a team. There are likely people on campus, so they may be hard to find. Yes, definitely a takeaway is don't do it alone. It will take 5+ years if you do it alone. All right, very quickly, I'm going to go through my takeaways because I have a lot of them. The first one is you can't copyright. I'm not a lawyer, but I learned you can't copyright ideas, facts, or concepts. Only the expression of those ideas, facts, or concepts. I think this is basically the fundamentals of Wikipedia. Wikipedia can give so much information out, but it's Creative Commons licensed because even if it's giving the ideas from copyrighted scientific papers or a summary of a copyrighted book, it is the expression of those ideas that you can put any license you want on them. For two, yeah, when you create, you have power over your intellectual rights. We have automatic copyright in the US. As soon as you make it, you can license it, or it's copyrighted. You have to apply a Creative Commons license to be able to make it OER and shareable. But you have power in doing that. I feel like one of the scary things about OER is how much you have to make, but I think a lot of people are already supplementing with stuff they have made from scratch. Maybe find a way to incorporate that and apply a Creative Commons license to it. There are some things that don't have a Creative Commons license, and I'm basically calling fair use on but I don't recommend that. It's a little scary to me. But there have been presentations about how to use fair use in OER materials. That's what that link is to. So another thing I did to try to avoid copyright stuff is if you link to an external copyright resource directly to that resource, so they get the clicks and they get the ad revenue, that's okay. I didn't like doing that because then I can't edit those materials. If they disappear, I don't know what's going to happen with them. Avoid it, but sometimes that's what you have to do. Another thing that I did that was probably crazy is commission people to make stuff for me and pay them. I think actually that's a different takeaway, but I'll mention it now. Or I'd find an article and think, oh, it's so great. What if I contact the author and ask them for permission to use it in my textbook? And usually they did, which is nice. And I kept a copy of that communication, but it's still not going to be shareable. No one else can use it. I can use it, but no one else can. And then if they did, like I commission someone and I say, hey, I need you to make this, but I need it to be open licensed, or I want this kind of license. And they're like, okay, but I don't think they really understand what that means or Creative Commons licensing means. It's just too murky. So you could do that if you really need something very specific. Just keep your communication that they agreed to this license. But I find it very, very murky. Takeaway 6. I feel like OER, we tend to think a lot about textbooks, text materials. And so I really want to encourage other kinds of OER, especially those H5P interactive things, video. I also had worksheets, exercises, assessments, the instructor guide, answer key, which I had my students make. I would be like, hey, can I use your correct answers in the answer key? And they really enjoyed that. They felt like they were a part of this cool process. Also, like we talked about before, a lot of people talk about OER repositories. 90% of the stuff in my textbook I found in a Google search. If you do the advanced search where you can look by license or by permissions, and then of course you need to verify that that text or image has that license. But most of my stuff is not from other OER textbooks or from repositories. It was a lot of research. I had to find ways to organize what I was finding. I had a lot of bookmarks and like different folders for each of those units, throwing stuff in there and bookmarking. So make sure you find a curation tool so you can keep up with where these things came from. Oh, what happened to my time? Okay. Again, it is time consuming. I think students definitely have a place in the process. One really big thing is renewable assignments, which is basically student created OER. So I would say maybe look into that in helping you out. And then that's a great learning experience for them and something, they're so proud that they get to write something or make something that ends up, shareable to the public. Another takeaway is I realize with my book being about Greek mythology, about English, Western American culture, that it seems very Western centric, Eurocentric. I think the way I balance that out is in the assignments, is the textbook is talking about this view, talking about these stories, these articles. Now it's your turn, and allowing them to have their voice, especially international students. They could be writing about Chinese mythology and how it, shows up in their culture and in their language. Or talking about an adventure story. What's an adventure story from your culture that you want to share with us, and comparing these mythologies? So thinking about it as, how can I bring in the student perspective in some of these, or making sure you have diverse voices in your OER. And of course, making sure it's accessible. Not only OER is accessible financially, it's available online and anyone can get to it. But if they're using an assistive technology, they have a disability, can they still consume this OER? Don't be afraid to mix and match from various resources. That's also basically what my textbook is kind of taking from a variety of sources. That's why mine is more of a collection rather than a remix, where it's taking from different resources, but then applying one license to everything. Making sure that your OER has a place to live that's not on the internet, I think, is important. And making sure it's easy to edit. My PDF, not easy to edit. My online version, not easy to edit. So one thing I want to do is make available a Word version so that people can get the text and edit it more easily. Have your contact information available. If people find misspellings or an error, or they want to say how great it is, have contact information available. Is this the last one? Yeah, basically the last one. But then, like I mentioned before, it'll never be perfect. I at some point, it's like it needs to be done. And if something needs to be updated, if something needs to be changed, it's OER. It is time for someone else to come in and adapt for how they need to use it. But however, when people get grants, I feel like in the grant process, they create something, the grant is over, they get their money, they never look at it again. I think there should be some iteration and some updating along the way. All right, I have like 2 minutes. If anyone has questions, here's my contact information and my website, and we have 2 minutes. If anyone has questions.
I think we could probably take a little more than 2 minutes if you have the time. I think we have a break after this. But yeah, I'm really interested in student created or student driven assignments, that sort of open pedagogy aspect of your work.
Mm-hmm.
How did your students get through that? I mean, it's kind of a new way of working with students for a lot of instructors.
Yes, and I think there are so many different things you could do. I think one big thing has been having students make Wikipedia articles as part of their student generated OER and their renewable assignment. Some people have different student groups writing articles, which will basically become a chapter, putting those together and making an OER textbook from that. For me, mostly what I did was the answer key. And that was basically just telling all of them like, hey, I'm building an answer key for the instructor. Can I use your answers? And I would go to specific students. I would tell them like, wow, you were really on point with the exercises for this week. Can I, do I have permission to use your answers for the answer key? And they really liked that. One of them even volunteered, like he really liked the vocabulary exercises. And so he just said, hey, can I, even for the chapters we don't cover this semester, can I just do all of the vocabulary exercises? You tell me if I'm correct, and then you can use my answers in the answer key. And he loved that. Another easy thing I did was I wanted to have essay examples for instructors. And so when students had really great exemplary essays, I would ask them, hey, can I put this on the textbook website as an example essay? And that was, they really liked that too. So I think there are a lot of different, there's easy ways like that. And then there's more of the like having an in-class project where they're writing and then using those materials. Of course, explain what you're going to do with it, explain a little bit about Creative Commons licensing, how it's going to be shared publicly, make sure that that's transparent. And usually it's a little daunting and scary for them. But in the end, they're like, oh my gosh, I actually created something that other people are going to look at and benefit from. So they really like that process.
I would also like to remind people who were here yesterday that Bo-Young Chai, our keynote speaker, referred to creating OER as a Herculean effort twice.
Oh, yes.
I was gonna say that too. I noticed that Charity mentioned Herculean effort to create, and then Boyoung said a Herculean effort to create OER.
And a little bit of a Sisyphean task sometimes, at least in my case.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
Hi, this is Maggie. I was really interested in your, I'm not sure if it was an idea or something you implemented in terms of them sharing their cultural myths or stories. If you did implement that, how was it? And if not, have you ever considered having a way to compile those stories into a book that could be used in future courses, where it's not just the Greek myths, but it could be, look how this Greek myth is very similar to this whatever culture myth, because often there are similarities, particularly among indigenous peoples all around the world.
Yeah. So they really enjoyed that, because I think especially international students, they love sharing their culture. And I have a whole introductory chapter, which is basically like what is a myth, and like kind of pre-explaining ahead of time that yes, we're going to focus in this textbook on Greek, but you will have opportunities, to reflect on stories from your own culture. And so I think having that at the beginning really helped. And then also like the universality, like making sure these themes are something that everyone's going to have some kind of experience with, no matter their culture. I think really helped with the buy-in. Initially, some of the buy-in I've had, or some of the issues I've had with students is like, oh, these stories aren't real. Why should I care? These stories are thousands of years old. why should I care? And so I tried to build that in front end with an introductory unit, and then also constantly throughout the book showing modern examples, modern usage in, articles. So, and yes, I feel like I'm done with my book. So if anyone else wants to make an OER textbook of other myths from their student writing, I am all for it.
Thank you.